In 2006, Microsoft looked at the iPod and saw a problem. Apple was building an entire ecosystem around them, and millions of people were buying in, and Microsoft had nothing like that. So they decided to fight back. The result was the Microsoft Zune, a music player that cost them over $1 billion, sold way lesser than expected, and became one of the most famous tech failures. So, what happened? Well, let's break it down. In the early 2000s, digital music players were booming in popularity. People were ripping CDs, downloading MP3s, and carrying entire music libraries in their pockets for the first time. There were plenty of MP3 players on the market, but Apple quickly separated itself from the pack. The iPod was way easier to use, and most importantly, connected directly to iTunes. Instead of hunting around the internet for music files and downloading malware, users could buy songs with a few clicks and sync everything seamlessly. By the middle of the decade, the iPod had become the default choice for portable music, and Microsoft hated that because Apple went the extra mile from just occupying market share to mind share. For years, Microsoft had been the company that defined consumer technology. Now, a growing number of young people associated with the innovation and cool design with Apple instead. So, Microsoft started planning its response, not just a device, but an entire ecosystem. The company reportedly spent years developing the project. It even acquired a company called Danger, which had experience building consumer electronics and software. Internally, the goal wasn't simply to release another MP3 player. The goal was to build Microsoft's answer to the iPod. And then in late 2006, the first Zune finally arrived. And at first glance, it looked promising. The screen was larger than one on many iPods. The interface felt modern and unique. The software looked surprisingly polished. And Microsoft introduced a feature that got a lot of attention at launch: wireless song sharing. Users could send songs directly between Zune devices without plugging anything in. I know this sounds very normal today, but don't forget this was back in 2006. However, there was just one catch. The person receiving the song would only listen to it a limited number of times before it expired, which made the feature significantly less exciting in practice. Still, the Zune had some genuinely good ideas, and that became a recurring theme throughout its life. Microsoft often managed to build features that were interesting. The problem was getting people to care. When Microsoft was launching the Zune, Apple was already way ahead. The iPod ecosystem was already massive, and competing against ecosystems is much harder than competing against single products. Microsoft discovered that almost immediately. Still, the first Zune sold reasonably well by normal standards. But Microsoft wasn't competing against normal standards. Apple sold millions of iPods every quarter. The Zune barely registered by comparison. Instead of disrupting the market, it became another alternative sitting next to the market leader. Microsoft kept trying. Over the next few years, the company released newer versions of the Zune. Hardware, software, design all improved. In fact, many people who actually used Zunes liked them. The Zune software on Windows earned a surprisingly loyal following too. Some users even preferred it over iTunes. Then Microsoft introduced something that, in hindsight, was arguably ahead of its time: Zune Pass. For a monthly subscription fee, users could stream and download music from a large catalog. Again, this launched years before Spotify was mainstream. Microsoft had stumbled onto a genuinely forward looking idea. The problem then was timing. Consumers were still heavily attached to buying music outright and owning it. Another problem was the music being wrapped into the Zune ecosystem. Having a great service doesn't help much if very few people use the platform it's attached to. And then the ground shifted beneath the entire industry. In 2007, Apple launched the iPhone, and suddenly the biggest threat to the Zune wasn't another music player. It was a whole smartphone. People started realizing they didn't necessarily want a phone and a music player in separate pockets. They wanted one device that would do both. This doesn't mean music player markets disappeared overnight, but its future became much less certain, and Microsoft found itself in a difficult position. The company was already struggling to catch Apple's music player business. Now it had to deal with smartphones changing consumer behavior for the first time. Apple led the way. The iPhone gradually absorbed more and more of the iPod's role. Consumers followed. Microsoft, meanwhile, was spread across multiple battles. It was defending Windows, competing in gaming, working on mobile software. Trying to challenge Apple in music became harder to justify. Sales never reached the levels Microsoft had hoped for, and market share remained tiny. The ecosystem never gained enough momentum. Developers are more willing to support platforms with large user bases. Accessory makers follow customer demand. Success tends to attract more success. Failure tends to do the opposite. The Zune ended up trapped in that cycle. The smaller it remained, the harder it became to grow. Then things got worse. As smartphones became more capable, dedicated media players started looking increasingly unnecessary. Consumers who might have considered buying a Zune years earlier were now buying phones. The entire category was shrinking. By 2011, Microsoft officially discontinued Zune hardware. A few years later, the Zune music service disappeared as well. The sub brand was effectively dead. After years of development, multiple hardware generations, software investments, marketing campaigns, and more than $1 billion in spending, Microsoft's attempt to challenge the iPod was over. So, why did the Zune fail? Part of the answer is simple: it arrived late. By the time Microsoft entered the market, Apple had already built an enormous lead. The iPod was already the default choice. Changing that would have required something drastically better, not merely competitive. Another reason was that Microsoft's strongest ideas often failed to translate into compelling reasons to switch. People already had iPods, already had libraries. Convincing them to abandon all of that was incredibly difficult. And then smartphones changed the game entirely. The market Microsoft was trying to conquer started disappearing before the company could establish itself. In some ways, the Zune was unlucky. In other ways, it was a classic example of how hard it is to catch up once an ecosystem gains momentum. What's fascinating is that Zune wasn't remembered because it was terrible. Plenty of terrible products are forgotten. The Zune is remembered because it was actually pretty decent. It had good hardware, good software, some surprisingly ahead of time ideas, yet none of that was enough. Because in technology, being good doesn't always guarantee success. Sometimes you're just competing against timing. But this doesn't mean Apple hasn't had its share of failures as well. One of their biggest flops was iPhone mini. Click on the video to watch it. And yes, please hit like, subscribe for more tech stories, and I'll see you in the